called him suicidal, homicidal, genocidal. But those were just words until you saw him step inside the ring. Every chair shot, every table break, every dive through barbed wire told the story of a man who didn't wrestle for fame or applause. He wrestled as if his life depended on proving something no one else dared. His name was Sabu, and behind his wild scars and stitched-up body was a truth far darker than the gimmick you saw on TV. This wasn't just a man with no fear of pain. This was a man who carried grudges deeper than wounds, and those grudges shaped his entire career. By 1994, Sabu had already begun carving his legacy in the unforgiving wrestling world of Japan. His daredevil stunts made him a legend overseas, but what made him notorious was his refusal to play by the rules, both inside and outside the ring. It was in Japan that he crossed paths with a young, technically gifted wrestler named Benoit. Sabu admired his skill, enough to recommend him for a job in ECW. But even before they shared the ring, Sabu noticed something he didn't like. Benoit carried himself with a cold seriousness that made him seem unapproachable, arrogant even. And when their paths finally collided in an ECW ring, everything changed in a single instant. The match was supposed to be a showcase, two rising stars, destined to deliver a brutal, unforgettable fight. But within minutes, the match ended in tragedy. Benoit's move went wrong, snapping Sabu's neck and sending shockwaves through the arena. The crowd fell silent, not realizing that the man known for being indestructible had just come one step away from paralysis. For 30 terrifying seconds, Sabu's right side went numb. He lay there, unable to move, staring at the ceiling, wondering if his career and his life had just ended. Yet, true to his name, he rose again. His body healed, but his opinion of Benoit never did. What made it worse was that the incident could have been forgiven. In wrestling, accidents happen. Broken bones and torn ligaments are part of the business. But to Sabu, the injury wasn't the only scar. It was Benoit's cold, detached attitude that haunted him. Benoit wasn't a man of warmth or friendship, and Sabu believed he only spoke when they were booked to wrestle. To Sabu, that silence was louder than any crowd. The man who had broken his neck never broke the ice, and that left bitterness lingering long after the pain subsided. But there was one figure in Benoit's life that kept Sabu's anger from boiling into hatred: Nancy, Chris's wife. To Sabu, Nancy was like family. She had helped him when he was just starting out, offering kindness in a business where kindness was rare. And so when the news broke in 2007 that Chris Benoit had murdered Nancy before taking his own life, Sabu was shattered. The man who had already been a thorn in his career now became the villain of a tragedy that shook the entire wrestling world. For Sabu, Nancy's death wasn't just another story on the news. It was personal. But Benoit wasn't the only rival who made Sabu's blood boil. In the early days of ECW, Sabu found an ally in a wrestler who at first seemed destined to be his brother-in-arms, Taz. Their first match together became one of Sabu's all-time favorites. They fought side by side, even capturing the ECW Tag Team Championships. Yet, as time passed, something shifted. Taz grew distant, developing an ego that clashed with Sabu's fiery pride. What once was healthy competition slowly twisted into something darker. Taz wasn't just a rival in the ring. He was becoming a rival for power, influence, and respect. The jealousy between them was raw and open. Sabu envied Taz's closeness to ECW's mastermind, Paul Heyman. While Sabu lived in Michigan, far from the promotion's home base, Taz lived nearby. That meant constant access to Heyman, constant opportunities to whisper in his ear, and the power to tilt the scales in his favor. Every time Taz got what he wanted, Sabu felt the walls closing in. For Sabu, wrestling wasn't just about winning in the ring. It was about surviving behind the curtain, where politics were often more dangerous than pile drivers. And in those back rooms, Taz was beginning to win. The tension boiled over in 1995. Sabu, lured by the promise of a bigger payday, skipped an ECW booking to wrestle in Japan. The problem? He was supposed to face Taz that night. His no-show enraged not only the fans, but also Taz, who allegedly broke down to Paul Heyman, demanding justice. The fallout was brutal. Heyman, furious at the betrayal, publicly fired Sabu, humiliating him in front of the ECW faithful. From that moment, Taz spent a full year burying him in promos, mocking his absence, and turning the crowd against him. What began as respect between two warriors had now transformed into a feud fueled by jealousy, betrayal, and pure disdain. And yet, as much as Sabu despised Taz, he had an even bigger enemy, one he never saw coming. It wasn't another wrestler. It wasn't a broken neck or a lost match. It was the man behind the curtain, the so-called genius of ECW himself, Paul Heyman. The same man Sabu had trusted, the same man who once promised him the world, would become the very source of his deepest regret. Because when the lights faded and the chants died, Sabu realized that loyalty to Heyman may have cost him the greatest opportunity of his life. But what exactly did Paul Heyman do? How did he convince Sabu to turn down a fortune in WWF, only to leave him chasing bounce checks in ECW? And why did Sabu later say it was the single biggest mistake of his entire career? The answers to those questions lie in the next chapter of this story. A chapter where betrayal and broken promises weigh heavier than broken bones. In the mid-1990s, Sabu stood at a crossroads. On one side was the WWF, the biggest wrestling company in the world, offering him a steady salary rumored to be nearly $200,000 a year, a fortune for someone who was bleeding and breaking his body night after night. On the other side was ECW, a rebellious underground promotion led by the silver-tongued Paul Heyman. Paul painted a picture so bright that even a man like Sabu, hardened by pain, chose to believe. He told Sabu that ECW was about to explode, that soon it would rival the WWF, that Sabu himself would become a millionaire when pay-per-views, merchandise, and action figures rolled in. It was a dream too good to resist. So Sabu turned down the WWF's offer. He stayed loyal to Heyman, loyal to ECW, and loyal to the idea that rebellion could be bigger than the empire. But what followed was not fame, not fortune, and not action figures. What followed were bounce checks, excuses that grew more ridiculous with each passing month, and the crushing realization that Paul Heyman was not the savior of wrestlers. He was a salesman who never stopped selling. Sabu recalled one moment when Heyman told the locker room that a FedEx plane had crashed with all their money on board. The wrestlers laughed nervously, but deep down, they knew it wasn't a joke. Their pay was gone, and the dream was fading. For Sabu, the betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. He had trusted Heyman with his career. He had walked away from guaranteed money to fight for a company that could barely afford to pay him. By the time ECW folded, Sabu claimed Heyman owed wrestlers over $1 million in unpaid wages. He also said he never received a dime from the ECW video games or his action figure. The scars on his body were his proof of loyalty. The empty bank account was his reward. Years later, Sabu would look back and admit, the biggest mistake of my career was not taking the WWF's offer. But Heyman's betrayal wasn't the only wound Sabu carried during those turbulent years. Wrestling politics stretched far beyond ECW, and Sabu learned quickly that in this business, even your heroes could break your heart. In 1995, he got a taste of WCW, the company that was waging war with Vince McMahon's WWF. For Sabu, this was a chance to test the waters, to see if WCW could offer him what ECW never could. And it was here, in WCW's locker room, that he crossed paths with one of wrestling's living legends, Ric Flair. To Sabu, Ric Flair wasn't just another wrestler. He was the Nature Boy, a 16-time world champion, a man who embodied everything glamorous and powerful about professional wrestling. But the dream shattered the moment they met. Flair had wrestled Sabu's uncle, the Sheik, during the Old Territory days, and the disdain carried over to his nephew. In a locker room where respect was shown through a simple handshake, Flair deliberately ignored him. It was a small gesture, but for Sabu, it spoke volumes. His childhood hero had turned his back on him, and the bitterness that followed never left. That bitterness grew in the strangest way years later. In TNA, Sabu recalled seeing Ric Flair wandering around a hotel completely naked, stripped not just of clothing but of the aura that had once made him larger than life. For Sabu, that was the final nail in the coffin. Any shred of respect he had for Flair was gone. To him, To him, the Nature Boy was just another man who took himself too seriously. Another reminder that heroes in wrestling were nothing more than illusions. But Sabu's time in WCW wasn't just about Ric Flair. He also discovered how quickly politics could crush opportunity. He admitted that at one point, WCW officials Kevin Sullivan and J.J. Dillon wanted to sign him. It could have been the breakthrough he was waiting for. But Heyman wasn't about to let go of his prized rebel so easily. When he discovered that Sabu was secretly talking with WCW, Heyman called their office and threatened to sue. Just like that, the deal was dead. And Sabu was once again trapped under Heyman's thumb. That betrayal would come back to haunt him in 2001 when WWE ran the infamous Invasion storyline. Former ECW and WCW stars were brought in to create a war against Vince McMahon's company. It should have been the perfect stage for someone like Sabu, a man who embodied ECW's rebellious spirit. But when his name came up, Paul Heyman, now working with WWE, made sure it was pushed aside. To Sabu, it was revenge. Revenge for daring to talk to WCW years earlier. Revenge for almost slipping away from Heyman's control. Even when ECW was dead, Paul Heyman's shadow still blocked his path. By the time WWE revived ECW in 2006, Sabu was older, worn down, and carrying more scars than most men could imagine. But the locker room politics never changed. There he found himself clashing with a new breed of wrestlers who, like Benoit and Taz before them, took themselves far too seriously. One of them was Test, a towering figure who believed his size gave him the right to refuse selling moves for smaller wrestlers. Another was Kurt Angle, a world-class athlete whose obsession with over-planning matches drove Sabu to the brink of madness. To Sabu, these men weren't warriors, they were roadblocks, each one reminding him that no matter how far he went, wrestling would always test his patience more than his pain tolerance. But through all the betrayals, the jealousy, and the broken promises, one truth remained. Sabu never stopped fighting. He fought in rings covered in barbed wire. He fought against broken bones and broken trust. And he fought against an industry that often treated him as disposable. Yet, every time the world tried to bury him, he came back swinging. Still, one question haunted him. Had it all been worth it? Was the legacy of scars and grudges worth more than the opportunities he had sacrificed? That's the question that loomed as Sabu entered the final chapters of his career. Because while the world saw a fearless madman, the truth was that behind the scars was a man who lived with regret, bitterness, and memories that no spotlight could erase. And in the end, perhaps his greatest battle wasn't against Benoit, Taz, Flair, or even Heyman. It was against himself. But if Sabu's story seemed like it had reached its peak, there was still one last twist waiting. Because in wrestling, just when you think the war is over, another fight always begins. And Sabu's final fight wasn't just about revenge or betrayal. It was about survival in a business that eats its own alive. Every scar tells a story. For most wrestlers, those stories end in retirement speeches, Hall of Fame inductions, or nostalgic tributes. But for Sabu, the scars told a different kind of story, one of betrayal, rage, and survival. By the time he entered the twilight of his career, he wasn't chasing championships or glory. He was chasing respect, and perhaps more than that, redemption. The problem was the wrestling world wasn't ready to give him either. In WWE's revived ECW brand, Sabu found himself surrounded by a new generation. Younger wrestlers looked at him like a relic of the past, a man too wild, too reckless, too unpredictable to belong in a corporate environment. Management didn't see him as a main event star. They saw him as a throwback, someone to thrill the fans for a moment before being pushed aside. For a man who had sacrificed everything, it was the ultimate insult. Sabu wasn't just overlooked. He was underestimated, as if decades of broken bones and barbed wire scars meant nothing. And then came the clashes. In the locker room, Sabu butted heads with Test, who mocked smaller wrestlers and refused to sell their moves. To Sabu, this wasn't just arrogance. It was disrespect to the very essence of wrestling, a business built on making your opponent look like a threat. Sabu remembered how Test bragged that at 6'7", he would never sell for him or CM Punk. But it wasn't just Test. Kurt Angle also became a thorn in his side. obsessed with perfection, would drag Sabu into hours of rehearsals, turning matches into science projects instead of fights. For a man who thrived on chaos, Sabu felt suffocated. Yet, despite the friction, he kept going. Because that's who Sabu was. He didn't care if the crowd booed or cheered. He didn't care if management tried to bury him. He wrestled for the thrill of it. For the rush of hearing silence turn into shock as he launched himself through tables, ladders, and sometimes even fire. But the more he fought, the more it became clear. His war wasn't just with opponents in the ring. It was with the business itself. A business that promised loyalty but delivered betrayal. And betrayal was a theme that never left him. Paul Heyman's lies about millions of dollars haunted him. Ric Flair's cold shoulder still stung. Benoit's crime against Nancy broke his heart. Taz's jealousy poisoned their friendship. Everywhere Sabu turned, the business reminded him that trust was a weakness, and yet he kept coming back, almost as if wrestling itself was both his curse and his salvation. What made Sabu different was that he never pretended to be anything other than what he was. He wasn't polished like Flair. He wasn't technically perfect like Benoit. He wasn't a corporate champion like Angle. He was raw, chaotic, and dangerous. He was the man fans looked at and thought, he's not supposed to survive this. But somehow, he always does. And that in many ways became his greatest legacy. Not the titles, not the money, but the image of a man who refused to break, no matter how much the world tried to shatter him. But behind the legend was a man who admitted regrets. In interviews, Sabu openly confessed that not taking WWF's offer was the biggest mistake of his life. He wondered what might have been: merchandise deals, steady paychecks, mainstream fame. Instead, he was left with bad checks, empty promises, and memories of hotel rooms and locker rooms where betrayal seemed to lurk at every corner. For all his toughness, Sabu was still human, and those regrets weighed on him heavier than any steel chair. Still, there was something hauntingly beautiful about the way he embraced his fate. He didn't run from the scars. He didn't deny the mistakes. He wore them like badges of honor, reminders that while others might have chosen the safe path, he chose the hard one. And though it cost him comfort, it gave him something few wrestlers ever truly earned: authenticity. When fans saw Sabu, they didn't see a character. They saw the real thing. And maybe that's why his story continues to resonate. Because in a world of staged victories and scripted betrayals, Sabu's battles were painfully real. The broken neck, the bounced checks, the lost opportunities. They weren't just storylines. They were his life. And while many wrestlers fade into obscurity, forgotten when the lights dim, Sabu's scars ensure that his name will never disappear. He became the symbol of wrestling's darkest truth. That greatness often comes at the cost of everything else. So in the end, was Sabu truly the unbreakable man? Or was he a cautionary tale of what happens when loyalty blinds you, when pride holds you back, and when the industry you love takes more than it ever gives back? That's the haunting question his career leaves behind. And maybe the better question is this: If you had been in Sabu's shoes, offered money, security, and fame by WWF, or loyalty, chaos, and betrayal by ECW, what choice would you have made?